Hello everybody, this is Dr. Novak again. I'm going to do a water test on my aquarium. Basically I'm going to be testing for nitrates using the API test kit instead of the Lamont. The Lamont test kit's a little expensive. This API here, it's more readily available just about in every pet store that you can go to. And the Lamont test kit also has, it's a more professional kit, so it's going to cost a lot more money than what people want to spend. Plus the fact it comes with some of the chemicals in some of these test kits are poison. And maybe those who have little children wouldn't want to have such a test kit in case the kids got into it. So I understand. So I thought, well, I'll try this API test kit out, and I'm going to test for nitrates. It's been a couple weeks. I haven't done any water changes in more than 2 weeks because I wanted the aquarium to have a higher bacteria load in it so it would inoculate the BCB basket that I made and the canister filter, which was my last video. If you remember my last video, I made a BCB basket and I put it into an ADA Superjet 600 canister filter, and it seems to be working. The water is crystal clear, no problems, and I did notice the fish seem to be a lot more active. Now the water's clear. I can't say anything really negative about it. So I decided to do some research on my own, and I kept watching a bunch of videos on nitrates. And I was quite surprised at the high level of nitrates that are in aquariums to this day. This is year 2020, going on 2021, and people are still dealing with extremely high nitrate levels. And they have the assumption that high levels of nitrates and phosphates really aren't that harmful to fish. And that's really not true. Fish are not in the wild exposed to high levels of nitrates like we have in our aquariums. They're lucky to even be exposed to 5 parts per million. The tropical fish of which we have. Because nitrates are going to mean eutrophication of the system, which means the downfall of the system. And that means, like a pond, usually that happens maybe after 100+ years. And we do that at warp speed in our aquariums so quickly that we put 100 years of waste in our aquariums in no time at all. And that's really a shame. And I've always thought that. But the stress factor in a fish, if anything really starts going above 5 parts per million, even of nitrates, starts affecting the fish in negative ways. And of course, this is getting into creating hormones, glucocorticoids, and these hormones are created in fish of anything over 5 parts per million. That's what my tests have revealed. And the videos that I watched, they were reading anywhere between 20, 40, 80 parts per million of nitrates. And of course they all were very nice videos. They all explained that maybe they lacked on maintenance or they hadn't done a water change. There was always some excuse, right, with every one of the videos. But one of the videos that I put a link to that I did, and to show people that they actually had 2 tanks exactly the same. They had neon tetras in it, 13 of them. Both tanks were heavily planted with very aggressive plants. One had CO2, one didn't. They both had the same light, the same amount of light. They both were fed, I think, 2 grams of food. Both tanks were, the experimental tanks. One tank, the nitrates and phosphates kept climbing every week, while the other tank showed none. The one that was had the CO2 being injected into it. So the plants were taking care of the CO2 and the nitrates and ammonia and everything else. Of course, if you can get rid of ammonia, you're not going to have nitrates. So that's one thing that you have to think about. Get rid of the ammonia and you won't have nitrates, because it's not going to be broken down. It doesn't have to be broken down. Anyway, these 2 tanks showed that when people say plants use nitrates, that's not necessarily 100% even true. In fact, that's not even factual. Unless your plants are aggressively growing and you're using CO2, the odds of them taking in nitrates is chemical work, and they're not going to do it then, because it is too much chemical work and it has to be done during peak photosynthesis, because it takes a lot of energy to convert nitrate into ammonia, which it's the ammonia that's used for their proteins and amino acids, not nitrates. That's got to be broken back down to ammonia. So when we have tanks like we have, and they're not with CO2 or anything, it's very hard to get those plants to utilize the nitrates as a food source unless there's very little nitrates to begin with. And that's why you see planted aquariums with very light fish loads. And basically, the aquariums are more geared towards plants than they are towards the aquatic life that lives in them. Now, with all these videos that I watched, and you can watch them too, all you have to do is just go in there, put in nitrates. One thing I noticed with every aquarium, they did have plants in them, they did have fish, but all the substrate was placed directly at the bottom of the aquarium in every single video. Not one took the substrate and took it off the bottom of the aquarium. Now, I don't know how all this started, where all of a sudden today substrates are placed directly on the bottom of aquariums. Now, let me give you an example here. You're trying to create a biotope, right? You understand that in your aquarium. You're trying to do this balancing act. So let's say you took a tank, whatever size you want, and you took it to a natural pond or a natural lake, and you put the tank in there and you pushed it into the soil 2, 3, 4 inches, and then you put a piece of glass underneath it, okay, and you took it out and you put it in your house. Now, you would think you would have the perfect biotope, correct? It'd be perfect. It's got to be perfect because it came from a natural system. You would have all the fauna, you'd have all the bacteria, you would have everything going for you. But you couldn't be more wrong. Because once you put that piece of glass underneath the aquarium, you blocked off the intersection of topography between groundwater and the water exchanging in and out of the substrate easily. This is where people fail. When you put your substrate directly on the bottom of an aquarium, that's what you are doing. You are like putting that piece of glass on the bottom. The water cannot easily go in and out of the substrate any longer. Now, this was proven back in the 40s And it was used during the 40s and 50s and 60s, where that's where they came up with the undergravel filter, because they realized putting substrate directly on the bottom of what it did. And they found out that water needed to move in and out of the substrate freely. Of course, then they went overboard trying to copy sewage treatment plants by making the water move even faster through the substrate. But that's something else altogether. But they actually had it right in the very beginning. They used like a 1/2 inch lift tube, 5 or 6 inches long, and they used to send bubbles through it. It didn't move much water at all through the substrate. It moved very little water through the substrate. And they actually had it right. That's what it should be. The water should move slowly, very slowly through the substrate. So I decided to test it with this API test kit here. And as you can see, it had 0 nitrates. And I feed these fish 6 to 7 times a day because I can, and they have grown, they're healthy, have no problems. Now since I put the BCB in, I see the algae is starting to die off. That was starting to grow, but that's very common. You're going to get some algae even if you use a BCB, only because algae is part of the ecosystem of an aquarium. You're going to have some algae. You're never going to get away from it. And that's a good sign. It's not a bad sign. It's a good sign. We may not like all the algae that we are growing, but it doesn't necessarily mean everything's going bad. Certain algae, yes, they will mean things are going awry, but a lot of algae mean things are just healthy and they're maturing. And this is the way limnologists actually test water systems, by testing how many different algae are in the water system and to find out what is happening to the system. Is it dying off? Does it have, algae that prefer, acidic conditions over alkaline conditions? And you really get involved in when you do testing like that. So when I decided to do these tests to find out about the nitrates, and like I said, I watched all these videos, we know that for a fact, because I did the test on Carassus auratus, that even at low levels, the fish were actually showing stress. Now, this stress may not be something that is, really clear and visual to all people, because it's no different than us. If we're being stressed out, we may not show outwardly any stress, but the stress is still there nonetheless. And the hippocampal of the fish was being destroyed, and it was showed degeneration of the hippocampal from nitrates, causing the excess amount of hormone in the fish that was destroying it. Now, this stresses out an animal. It stresses out humans. It causes us, when we have stress like that, it causes us to maybe have insomnia. Other parts of stress could do other things, as we all know. It can cause other problems when we have stress, ulcers, heart disease. It does the same thing to a fish. So nitrates were always thought to be one of those byproducts that were harmless, and they can go up to 40, 50, 60 parts per million. But in reality, it takes very little nitrates to start stressing fish out. Most hobbyists probably don't care, because if the fish aren't showing some outward sign, such as a sickness or fin rot, tail rot, or cloudy eyes, or they're not quite as active as they did, if this happens at a very slow rate, you may never notice it. Otherwise, if your fish look good, you're going to say, oh, so what? I have 40 parts per million, 60 parts per million of nitrates. I don't really care. But it does wind up causing problems. It could cause a lot of problems with your nitrogen cycle because of the fact your algae could start using the nitrates as a food source, and a lot easier than your higher order plants that we use, because they do not need as much CO2 as a plant does to really work very hard. And they don't need as much light as a higher order plant does in order for them to photosynthesize. And then there are other algae that we call them algae, but they're not. They're really bacteria, like cyanobacteria. A lot of people just call it an algae. That can start taking over and start destroying an aquarium at lightning speed. So when I came up with the idea of the anoxic filter and the PCB, these are two problems I had to try to solve. In ponds, you can't have an under gravel filter, or you can't have a plenum. That's just out of the question. So I made the BCBs so when the water flowed past them, it would take the ions and utilize these ions as a food source, the Factata bacteria. Now, when I talk about making a slow-moving plenum versus putting substrate directly on the bottom, because if you put substrate directly on the bottom, you could have a nitrate producer instead of a user. And if you have more nitrate producers in your aquarium than users, you're going to have an overabundance of nitrates. Okay, this is why all these videos show these people with so many nitrates. This is why in the experiment that the two guys did with the tanks, that one had CO2 and one didn't, one tank, the nitrates and phosphates just kept climbing and climbing and climbing, even though they had a ton of plants, because they weren't being injected with CO2, where the CO2 tank had no nitrates and phosphates. So this goes to show you it doesn't take much to have a nitrate producer. But in that video where they had the two tanks, the failure was they once again put the substrate directly on the bottom of the aquarium. Watch the video and you'll see what I mean. That becomes a nitrate producer. What you're trying to do is take away in your aquarium anything that becomes a nitrate producer. So when you make a slow-moving plena, okay, you're taking the gravel off the bottom, you are moving water through the bottom very slowly, and there's an exchange process. Now the Germans tried this, and they tried it with heating cables, and that would cause convection through the substrate. That way you put your substrate directly on the bottom, but you had heating cables. Well, we're foregoing the heating cables because we found out that the heating cables, they didn't work in the summer, and therefore your substrate would start to turn black at the bottom. And I proved this in the classroom. We proved it. In the summertime, it started turning black. And then in the wintertime, when the heating cables were used, the oxygen go back there, and then it became oxygenated, and the black would start disappearing some. But this becomes a nitrate producer, because if you have anaerobic bacteria turns nitrates back into ammonia. It makes more ammonia that has to be broken down into nitrates. So as the ammonia starts coming up, then you have aerobic bacteria that break it back down to nitrates. And then you have the anaerobic bacteria on the very bottom that turn around and take those nitrates and break it right back down to ammonia. And you see the cycle that happens when you put substrate on the bottom of your aquarium. The smaller the substrate, in other words, the diameter of the substrate size, the millimeter, 1 millimeter to even less, like sand or something, it gets compounds and becomes even worse. That's why in the 70s they stopped using sand, because sand caused too many problems with nitrates. Same reason why they stopped using wet dry filters. It caused too many problems with nitrates. Wet-dry filters became nitrate producers. They were able to break down ammonia 30% faster than, let's say, a substrate, a gravel bed, or a canister filter, or a hang-on-the-back filter. But they produce nitrates like crazy, and then they found out they were fouling up their tanks, making their tanks turn all kinds of algae problems and saltwater tanks, and now you really don't see wet, dry filters anymore. They're kind of gone. Everybody did away with them, and they said they're nitrate producers. They didn't like that. So this is what happens in our aquariums. We make nitrate producers, and we have no way of getting it out except a water change. Now, adding this BCB basket to a canister filter is great, because you see people, they do reviews on canister filters, how they clean them and everything else, right? We all see that. And what do? They have to clean all their media out in aquarium water, and we never used to do that. We never had to clean our media in aquarium water. You took it, you cleaned it real good under the sink, you sterilized everything, and you put it all back, and nobody had ammonia spikes. If you're cleaning your filter material, your hang on the back or your canister filter, and you have an ammonia spike, you had a problem. You don't have a aquarium that has a good ecosystem. It is a failing system. If you have to baby your canister filter with the BCB in a canister filter, all I have to do is pull the basket out, set it off to the side, take all your floss or whatever you have, sponges, clean them out, throw them away, clean out the canister real good. You don't have to worry about the bacteria, because the bacteria stays in the basket where it belongs. You're not cleaning that basket, you're not taking it apart, and you just put it back in after you put all new stuff in and fire it back up, fill it full of water, and the water is not going to bother it, even if it has a little bit of chlorine in it, because as soon as you fire it up, it's going to mix up and it's going to be diluted anyhow. And your bacteria is not going to die. And you don't have to worry about bacteria. I don't even worry about spikes. That is idiocy when you can't clean hang on the back filter, your canister filter, because you're so worried you're going to have an ammonia spike. You got other problems than in your tank. Your tank is too dependent on your canister filter, or your filter that's supposed to be a mechanical filter. You have biological and mechanical. So remember that when you make a tank. Nitrates, anything really above 10, you got to really have less than even 10. 5 is even better. Keep them low. It'll help keep bacteria in check. It'll help keep your algae in check. It'll make your fish healthier. That's why my fish live for 30 years. And I have goldfish for 15 years plus. It's because they don't get stressed out by their environment. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something from it, that nitrates can easily be handled today with an anoxic filter. But of course, it's your choice. It's not the fish's choice. It's your choice whether or not you want your animals to live in nitrate-free water or not. Until next time, this is Dr. Novak.